So now we move to saying a bit more about social construction technology. Sorry, this is a really boring PowerPoint. Just a list of names. This is it reads a bit like promotion. I'm embarrassed. So this approach was developed by myself and Wiebe Baker. Wiebe Baker is a Dutch sociologist of technology, and we developed this approach in 1984. Actually what we did in developing this approach, we worked before on the sociology of science, and we talked in science about, believe it or not, the social construction of scientific knowledge. That was a move that people were making in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and the trick was to extend that social construction of scientific knowledge to technology. Now, some of you may have come across a book by Berger and Luckman, The Social Construction of Everyday Life. Is that what it's called? It's the social construction of reality. Reality, thank you. This book is like, something's like a Bible. You know it so well, you sometimes forget the name of the things you know best. And that book, I think, which came out in 66 or 67, was enormously influential in how groups of people socially construct things. In other words, it's how things acquire meaning within a group of people. That's the key. It's a key sociological idea. And that's the idea that lies behind much of this work on social construction of technology. Wiebe Baker has written a book on this in 1995. I think this is probably on the reading list as well. And there's an article by myself and a historian of technology, I'm going to draw on, Ron Klein, which came out in 1996. Let's see if we've got some more exciting slides. Oh, good. Okay. So these are the main concepts in this idea of the social construction of technology. The idea is, one of the key things is that there's a social group who have share a particular meaning of a technology. We call this the relevant social group. Okay, so when you do a study within this approach, the first thing you're looking at is the social groups around a technology and the meaning that they share of the technology. Now, this only becomes really convincing when you work it through with an example, and that's what I intend to do in a minute. We'll have an example. Interpretive flexibility is a term that was taken over. I mentioned the impact and the influence of the approach in science. This actually is a term that came over from the sociology of science. Historians and sociologists had shown that scientists often debate about the facts of the matter. This happens during a research controversy at the research frontiers, whether something's one way or another way. You could think of the whole field of string theory itself as a controversial area. Is string theory the correct theoretical approach? So this will apply to theory as well as experimental results, which can be contested. And when such results are contested, we call this a moment of interpretive flexibility. There's more than one interpretation of reality available. Now, for science, establishing that was quite a struggle, because it seems counterintuitive, because most people think, oh, science, the facts are the facts. And the idea that somehow interpretation is involved in science, and that you have, in fact, interpretive flexibility, which means radical disagreements about the facts, is surprising for many people. But if you look at these controversies at the research frontiers, you actually find scientists actually do that. They debate different interpretations of facts and theory. So we took that idea over to technology, and I'll show you how that works in a little more with a minute with an example. So you have this moment. You can think of interpretive flexibility as a moment of opening, where there's more than, for technology, it's going to be more than one interpretation of a technology is shared by a social group. In science, we found that these moments of opening, when the scientists would disagree, say at the research frontiers, about the facts of the matter or about a particular theory, didn't last for very long and was followed by closure, agreement. Okay, so you may have a controversy over something in science, some particle, does it exist or not? Scientists usually within a very short period of time, sometimes a few months, may go on for a year or so, will have settled the issue. And then you have agreement and closure as to the facts of the world. And the model we're trying to apply to technology is very similar. We're saying that there are moments of interpretive flexibility with technology where there's more than one interpretation, but eventually you get one dominant interpretation of a technology. And that we call that moment closure, where one interpretation predominates. So that's called closure, sometimes referred to as stabilization as well. Now in this process, one's also looking, because I'm a sociologist, I'm also looking for the influence of the wider culture, things from the wider culture in this process of closure that leads to closure of technology. So that will be an important thing to look for. And this is the last theoretical term I promise you we're going to introduce, I hope so, today. The notion of a technological frame. This is what my Dutch colleague Wiebe Baker in his 1995 book introduced. And you can think of it as analogous to a term in science called paradigm. I should ask this. Is anyone here familiar with the book by Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions? No. Okay. Well, in that book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Kuhn is a historian of science, was a historian of science, he's at last no longer with us, and he argued that scientists work within a broad constellation of values, theories, and facts, and he called these things paradigms. And you can look at the history of science as a struggle between one paradigm and another. So, for instance, in the history of physics, you had something called the Newtonian paradigm, was overthrown when Einstein came along, first of all with special relativity, then with general relativity. So 1905, 1915, you have a radical change in physics, and a new paradigm comes into being. It's not just simply a switch in theory, but the very experimental procedures change as well, because theory and experiment, as many historians of science would argue, are closely bound up together. And so the idea is to apply a notion like paradigm to technology, and the term that Wiebe Baker used, rather than use the term paradigm, was to use the term frame. He talked about technological frames that people share, and we'll have an example of this in a bit. So these are the main concepts. Any questions at the moment about these concepts? And I'm going to try and illustrate them, put some flesh on them. Okay, good. One more concept. Users of agents of technological change. This is the development that Klein and myself came up with in this article in 1996. When we talked, first of all, about interpretive flexibility, that technologies could have more than one meaning, there was a struggle over meaning of technology. We hadn't thought as users themselves have been able to produce a radical new meaning of a technology. And what we found was that, in fact, users can, in certain circumstances, and we'll have a nice case study of this with the development of the motor car, can come up with new meanings of technology which radically challenge the predominant meaning. So you can see this notion of interpretive flexibility coming again into being with the work of users, and users actually producing change. We call them agents of technological change. Okay. So when we developed this approach, social construction of technology, we had a case study, and my colleague Wiebe Baker, being Dutch, is a historian of the bicycle. He works on the bicycle. And this was one of our main case studies. And particularly we were looking at this change around the 1890s. I don't suppose anybody's ridden one of these. In England we call this the penny farthing. It's actually called the ordinary bike. It was so standard at the time. The transition from that sort of bike to what was known as the safety bicycle, which is a version that you're probably more familiar with today. So the approach of social construction of technology, the first case study we had and we applied was to this particular case. The transition in a relatively, it's a period of about 10, 15 years from those penny farthing bikes which you'd have seen around 1880 to 1890, switches to the safety bicycle, which becomes, by and large, the stable technology until you get the mountain bike coming into existence. And the mountain bike is a different bike to the safety bike, and that's an interesting case. I'm not going to go into that. Other people have looked at the case of the mountain bike. So the first thing you want to do in a case study, if you want to analyze this change from this penny farthing bicycle to the safety bike, is to find the relevant social groups. So these are the groups that share a meaning of the technology. And in doing our work on the bicycle, Wiebe Baker and I found there were two social groups that we could identify that were particularly important. And you can think of these actually as kind of groups of users of the bicycle. One group were young men of means and nerve. The reason you had to have nerve was to ride those very high bikes. And they wanted to use this bicycle for sport. And you can even think about this as the macho bike. What they typically, this is, remember, we're talking a period here before you have paved roads. Okay, so roads are very uneven. You're on this high bicycle, this penny farthing bicycle, and it's very easy to fall off it. In fact, they had a special name for it. Let's go back to look at what the bike is. That bike there, you see you're high up there. It's dead easy to fall off. You fall forward, it's called doing a header. And there were many, because the roads were not paved, you could hit a big stone and you'd do a header. So it's actually very dangerous, these bikes, and you're very high up there. And they don't have bicycle helmets or anything like that back then either, of course. So this bike was used, we argue, by young men of means and nerve to show off. In other words, they'd ride the bike in parks to show off, and it was mainly used for a sporting purpose. And we called it the macho bike. Then we found another social group, which we classified as women and elderly riders, who wanted to use the bicycle for transport. They weren't interested in this showing off aspect, this sporting aspect. They wanted to get from A to B quicker. And for them, the bike had to be a safe bike. So this problem of doing the headers was a problem for them. So we identify these two social groups have different problems around the artifact of the bicycle. So let's talk a little bit more about the young men of means and nerve. By the way, just look to the second one there. Who are these young men of means and nerve? Professional men, clerks, schoolmasters, or dons. It's kind of interesting to think that they had means. A don is another word for a university lecturer, professor, like I am. Don't have quite so many means now, but back then they seemed to have more. So here's a quote from a British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph. Bicycle is a healthy and manly, so notice the gendering aspect here, pursuit, with much to recommend it. And unlike other foolish crazes, it has not died out. So he's talking about bicycling here on these ordinary bikes with the high wheels. So it's used for sport and showing off. Here's a picture of a young man with means and verve riding a bicycle called the Invincible. I got this from my father's cigarette collection. Here's cigarette cards, and this is a nice picture of this Invincible. These bikes are so big they have to be launched, so the gentleman with the bowler hat is launching the bike. Okay. Has anyone here ever ridden one of these bikes, by the way? No. The only person I know is actually my Dutch colleague, Weber Baker. He can ride one of these things. And sometimes when he gives a talk in a museum, they have one. He'll go up and ride the thing. Now, remember I said we were interested in how the wider culture also shapes. So we're looking here at how a particular technological artifact goes from one type of design to another type. And one of the things we're interested in, the influence of the wider culture on it. And clearly, issues to do with gender will be important here. And so there was a whole series of issues in Victorian Britain in particular about women riding bicycles. And here's a quote from: "The mere fact of riding a bicycle is not itself sinful, and if it is the only means of reaching the church on Sunday, it may be excusable." So women could ride a bike if they had to get to church. And one of the problems of women